Right, it's 7 o'clock. I want to give a special greeting to those of you who are watching the recorded version of this presentation. Uh, Greetings to you in the future. I hope the future is as wonderful as we imagine it, and I hope you've all got flying cars. Let's move ahead. Without any ado, we've got 90 minutes and a lot of ground to cover. So let me start my little clock here and away we go. My name is Pete Stahl. I'm with the League of Women Voters of the Los Altos Mountain View area, and I'm here to present the pros and cons of the ballot propositions for the November 24 election. I'm here representing the League of Women Voters Education Fund. League is divided into an education fund and an advocacy arm. The Education Fund is a nonprofit. We are nonpartisan and educational, and we aim to build citizen participation through events like this. And we conduct studies uh, of a lot of community issues at all levels of government in the unbiased manner, and we develop information that's used occasionally by the advocacy arm to create positions, but we are separate from them. So if you see that League has endorsed one side or another of an issue, that's not something that I'm connected with. Our agenda tonight, I will quickly go over some helpful online resources that you can use to enhance what you're going to see tonight. And I will cover the statewide propositions as well as 4 of the local ballot measures that you might encounter in our area. The ground rules. I will give description of each measure, and I will give you arguments for and against, or pro and con. I will present these without prejudice. It's up to you to evaluate whether they make sense. You might find that some of the arguments in favor or against some of these measures are ridiculous. And that's marvelous. That's very helpful. You can then make a note of that and say, don't vote that way, vote the other way. I will, as I say, do my best to hide my opinion. I actually hold very strong opinions on most of these issues. And if I do my job right tonight, you won't be able to tell. So let's see how well I do at that. It's up to you to decide what makes sense to you and mark your ballot. I will be taking questions tonight after every other ballot proposition. So I'll cover 2 ballot propositions, and then I'll pause and take a few questions as time permits. Please use the Q&A button that you'll see along the bottom row of your Zoom console to submit questions. All right, on to the online resources. The first one to recommend is the Easy Voter Guide, and it's available at easyvoterguide.org. We've also got hard copy that we distribute at libraries and other public spaces. If you visit easyvoterguide.org, you'll see this, and along the bottom, you'll notice that there are multiple languages available. Here is a typical entry in the Easy Voter Guide. Here's Proposition 32. It explains the way it is now, what would happen if it passes, how much money it might cost, and then a couple of quick arguments for and against it. The other online resource is for those who want to do a deeper dive. It's vote411.org, and that's nationwide, so I recommend you take a shortcut and go to vote411.org/California. If you go there and give it your address, as you can see, I've entered an address at the top, it will tell you what is on your ballot. If you click on one of those races, you see the View Race buttons along the side, then you'll see photos of the candidates. And if you then take a look at the view answers. If you click those two check boxes, you will be able to see much more information about these candidates. For example, answers to questions. What are your top 3 priorities? Here's how those candidates answered that questionnaire. You can also see some campaign finance information. Here you can see how much the candidates raised in total and how much they've spent and how much cash they've got on hand. One thing that I want to let you know is that the graphs are not intended to be compared to each other. So if you zoom in on the total raised, you'll see that even though the top graph is shorter than the bottom graph, the top graph actually represents almost twice as much money as the bottom graph. So read the numbers, don't depend on the length of the bars. And finally, this is our own website, League of Women Voters of Los Altos Mountain View. And we have oodles and oodles of information and tools, links to what I just showed you, and perhaps most important, links to recorded events like the one that you're listening to now. And here is a photo of the Los Altos City Council forum. So we have forums for all of the local races, and you'll be able to see the candidates in person and watch them answer questions. And now on to the ballot. It is a long ballot. There are federal offices for president, Senate, and House. There are state legislative offices, Senate and Assembly. There are county offices for Board of Education, judge, supervisor. There are educational board contests. There's city council. There's a healthcare district. You might live in an additional district that has things on the ballot. Make sure when you fill out your ballot that you fill out both sides and don't miss anything. And after you have waded through all of this, waiting to ambush you at the end of your ballot are 10 statewide propositions, and depending where you live, 0, 1, or 2 local ballot measures that you're going to have to think about. You get to become a citizen legislator on this ballot, and you will be asked about a kaleidoscope of issues that we're about to dive into. Let me remind you that you don't have to vote on all of them. If you leave one or more blank, it's okay. Your ballot will still be valid. And I know it will feel like you haven't done your job as a citizen, but I want to put in a plug for not voting for things that you have no idea. An uninformed vote is, I believe, worse than no vote at all. As I said, there are 10 state propositions. The first 5 have low numbers because they originated in the legislature, and the legislature wanted them to have a better chance of passing, so it gave them low numbers. There's a study that shows that there's something called ballot fatigue that makes people less likely to vote yes as they get towards the end of the ballot. The other 6 are initiatives. They qualified by petition and they get no special treatment in the numbering department. So let's jump in. Proposition 2. And as I said before, I'll be covering 2 ballot propositions and then taking a look at the Q&A. So use the Q&A if you have any questions. So Proposition 2 is a general obligation bond. It's $10 billion, and it will be repaid from the state's general fund over 35 years, I believe. The general fund is where your income taxes go and where the state portion of sales tax goes. And so what you're really voting on here is whether this item should be added to the state budget for the duration of the bond for the next 35 years. Oh, I've gotten ahead of myself here. In this case, the bonds are paying for buildings and renovations and facilities that are expected to be used at least over a 35-year period, perhaps longer. Um, and it's going to cost roughly $500 million a year. Um, and a recent study showed that over a third of students attended schools that don't meet standards for safety or for upkeep maintenance. They've got damaged walls and ceilings, gas leaks, power failures, and so on. The Proposition 2 funds are going to be distributed to local school districts based on matching local bonds. So at the end of tonight, you'll see a pair of local school construction and renovation bonds for the Los Altos district and for the Cupertino district. If those pass, then those districts can apply for funding from Proposition 2 or one of its predecessors, and the state will match that somewhere between 50 and 60%. And that way, the local bond becomes more powerful. So let's move on to the pros and cons of Proposition 2. Arguments in favor: students to serve, safe facilities. And if you believe that's important, you might want to support Proposition 2. Property tax limits require the state to assist with capital projects. In other words, what the local bonds raise isn't enough. The state has to kick in more because the localities are limited by the current state constitution in how much they can raise with local bonds. The bond money will be spent and controlled locally. This is true. And small or disadvantaged districts are eligible for more funding. This is a provision of Proposition 2 that allows districts that are unable to raise a certain threshold through local bonding to get increased matching by an additional 5%. Arguments against Proposition 2. California's already got over $100 billion in outstanding and unissued bonds. Why are we doing more then? The matching grant process makes rich districts richer, amplifying the disparity between rich and poor areas. Let me explain this one a little bit. As I said earlier, the grants are distributed based on matching property tax based bonds that each school district puts up. Because of disparities in real estate value, in assessed value of property, a school district in a high value area is able to raise far more in local bonds legally than an area with low property values. And a study from a research center at Cal, at UC Berkeley, has documented that, in fact, districts in wealthier areas have been qualifying for higher grants because they are able to raise more with these bonds. Finally, an argument against Proposition 2 is that as California's population declines, school systems should consolidate, and that would reduce the cost of facilities and renovations, and they would also realize income from renting out their unused properties, and that would be a better alternative than passing this bond. So that's Proposition 2. Proposition 3, same-sex marriage. Back in 2008, which is now 16 years ago, Californians passed a ballot proposition, Proposition 8, which defined marriage as between a man and a woman. Now, in 2015, the US Supreme Court invalidated Proposition 8 and ordered that same-sex marriage be recognized in all 50 states. Um, and so Proposition 8 is inoperative, but it is still in the California Constitution. Proposition 3 would remove that. The potential consequence of having the Prop 8 language in the California Constitution, even if it's inactive, is that a future US Supreme Court ruling could reactivate it in the same way that the Dobbs decision from a couple of years ago reactivated certain abortion laws in states. Proposition 3 will protect both same-sex marriage and interracial marriage. So let's take a look at the arguments pro and con. In favor of Prop 3 is the argument that it protects against future attempts to restrict marriage rights for same-sex or interracial couples, and also that it, at the same time, leaves in place laws regarding age, number of people in marriage, clergy rights, meaning the right of a priest or minister to marry who they wish. So those laws will stay in place if Prop 3 passes. Arguments against Prop 3. Same-sex marriage is already legal. This is an unnecessary proposition, and it fixes a problem that doesn't exist. And the language is ambiguous and could open the door to polygamy, child marriage, and more. Now, I'm not a constitutional law expert, so I can't address the apparent contradiction between the two bottom argument, the bottom argument here and the on either side. So this will be left up to you. Okay, good. So that's the first two propositions. Let's see if there are any questions. What is the size of California's annual budget? Oh my goodness, I used to know this. I believe it's in the neighborhood of $200 billion. But I will have to look that up. The next question is, what does it mean for a bond to be outstanding or non-issued? When we approve a bond measure like Proposition 2 or Proposition 4, which I'm about to get to, it authorizes the state to sell those bonds and borrow the money. But the bonds are not actually sold until I believe it's the controller, puts them on the market. So the state has lots of authorized bonds. Now, the outstanding bonds are the ones that have already been sold. Good. That seems to be the only questions on the first two ballot props, so let's move on. Proposition 4 is another general obligation bond. This is also for $10 billion, and it specifies a wide array of water-related projects, and these are all like the schools bond. These are capital projects that will pay for facilities and for equipment and various other long-lived assets. The goal here is to increase the supply and quality of water, to reduce flood risks for when we have atmospheric rivers, to improve wildfire prevention, to address sea level rise, protect fish and wildlife, restore habitats, to give a boost to the effort to install offshore wind turbines for energy production, improve parks, and protect communities from extreme heat. Once again, this will be repaid from the general fund, $400 million per year. Let me give you a little bit of the history here. We had a serious budget deficit earlier in 2024. Depending on which figures you look at, it was either 50 or $70 billion. And during the solution of that, a number of these climate programs were postponed, roughly $9 billion worth. So this was put on the ballot by the legislature as a way of compensating to continue the program's forward momentum, but spread the payments out over the next 40 years for facilities that were going to be used over those 40 years. So arguments in favor of 4. First, it helps address growing threats from fires, water pollution, and extreme heat, in other words, climate change. It backfills these $9 billion in cuts to the programs due to this year's budget crisis, and it shifts our posture from one of disaster response to disaster prevention, and that refers not only to wildfires, but also to sea level rise and to flooding and to drought. You might want to vote against Prop 4 if you agree that the state should not borrow to fix these problems because borrowing costs too much, and that Prop 4 funds certain unproven technologies with no real evidence of success. And finally, that wind turbines are a poor choice for our coastline, that they're unsightly and they're accident prone and they perhaps damage the birds out over the ocean. So that's Proposition 4. I'll do one more and then take questions. Proposition 5. Ooh, look at all those fives up there. 55% vote to approve local bonds. Currently, cities, counties, and regional districts have to get a 2/3 vote in order to get local bonds approved. Proposition 5 would reduce that from 2/3 down to 55%. Bonds passed by 55% could fund only certain capital expenditures, so they wouldn't be allowed to pass a bond in order to pay salaries for, say, the local firefighters, but they could do it for capital projects. So construction of affordable housing, construction of hospitals, police stations, creation of parks, and internet access, which should last a good long time. Reasons to vote for Proposition 5. First, it gives local voters more autonomy to address their own unique needs. And instead of 1/3 of the voters being sufficient to torpedo it, it would be 45%. Proposition 5 by itself does not raise taxes. That would be up to your local city, county, or regional district. 55% has worked splendidly for school bonds since 2000. I should mention here that school bonds are allowed to pass with just 55%, and that's because of a prior ballot proposition from 24 years ago. So you'll see at the end, when we get to the local bonds, a couple of them will require just 55%. Reasons not to vote for Proposition 5. First, it will ultimately result in higher property taxes. Even if Prop 5 doesn't raise taxes by itself, it will make it much easier for cities and counties to raise property taxes. It encourages borrowing, which is more expensive than pay as you go. And you might vote against 5 if you believe that bonds could fund first-time home buyer programs not appropriate for borrowing. So let me say a little bit about this. In your big, thick ballot pamphlet, in the back, it explains exactly what a 55% bond would be eligible to fund. And in there are first-time home buyer programs, which are typically grants to first-time home buyers or reduced cost loans, that kind of thing. And those do not qualify as capital expenses. On the other hand, Proposition 5 requires local oversight boards for the distribution of the bond money, and it's quite likely that these local oversight boards would not approve any expenditures of these bonds on things that would not leave the community with an asset at the end of the bond period. So that's Proposition 5. And let's see if we've got any questions. I'm looking over in the Q&A and we got nothing. So either you are completely stultified by what I've said so far, or I don't know, maybe I've been a little bit clear. Let's move on. Proposition 6, end forced labor in prisons. If you're like me, you looked at this title and you said, what? What do you mean forced labor? Didn't we get rid of that in 1865 with the passage of the 13th Amendment? Well, it turns out that the 13th Amendment has a loophole that it allows involuntary servitude to exist as punishment for which a party has been duly convicted. Proposition 6, and California therefore allows it. It's in our Constitution. Proposition 6 would reverse that. Proposition 6 would prohibit prisons from assigning mandatory unpaid work to inmates. Under current law, inmates who refuse such work may face retaliation, and that can consist of restricted recreational privileges, loss of family visits, solitary confinement for up to 10 days, and write-ups. And the write-ups go in the prisoner's record and become evidence at a parole hearing, and the write-ups might postpone or even prevent parole from being given to a prisoner. So these are serious bits of retaliation that the state can currently use as leverage on prisoners who will not accept forced labor. California is one of 16 states that allows forced labor in prisons. 34 other states have outlawed it. Reasons that you might vote in favor of Proposition 6. You might do that if you believe that it will restore human dignity and agency for inmates. If you believe that forced labor serves no rehabilitative purpose. Or if you believe that forced labor can interfere with classwork or other improvement programs that the prisoners undertake in order to rehabilitate themselves while in prison. You might vote against Proposition 6 if you believe that prison labor lets inmates give something back to the society that they've wronged, that dangerous criminals need something to do. I saw one US senator phrase this as idle hands are the devil's workshop. And you might vote against 6 if you believe that unpaid inmate labor saves money for the state. If Prop 6 passes, the state will still have to provide kitchen services, maintenance service, janitorial service that these prisoners are currently providing for free. The state will have to pay for it, and that will tend to increase costs to the state. So that's Proposition 6. And by the way, you might notice in your ballot pamphlet that there is no official argument against 6. And also there's no official argument against 35. That does not mean that there are no good reasons to vote against these measures. It's just that the process for getting a ballot argument into the ballot is very complex, and you have to move fast. And this I know because I actually wrote one of these ballot arguments back in 2009, and boy, did I have to run. So let's move on to Prop 32, and then I'll take some questions. Proposition 32 is the first initiative on the ballot. And currently, the statewide minimum wage is $16 an hour. Prop 32 would raise it to 18. $16 an hour is the floor, and many cities have a higher minimum wage than that. In particular, Los Altos, it's $17.75. In Mountain View, it's 1875. If Proposition 32 passes, these numbers will not change. But in areas where there is no local minimum wage, it will climb from $16 to $18, and it will go up annually to track inflation, of course. The new minimum wage will become effective next year for larger employers with more than 25 employees, and it'll be effective the following year for all employers. There are also currently higher minimum wages in place for fast food workers and hotel workers. I believe the fast food workers law is $20 an hour and statewide. Hotel workers is in certain localities such as Santa Monica, and I don't know what the figure is for that, but it's above $16, and these will also remain in effect. You might vote for 32 if you agree that even in the cheapest parts of California, it takes $20 an hour to afford the basics. Prop 32 doesn't get us all the way there, but it's a step in that direction. You might vote for 32 if you're interested that it improves the standard of living for millions of workers, or if you believe that it will help the economy by increasing worker spending on rent, groceries, and so forth. The theory behind this argument is that minimum wage workers spend money in their local community, and so it stimulates the local economy, and it increases patronage at local businesses. You might vote against 32 if you agree that it will hurt small and family businesses that are particularly vulnerable to higher operating costs and have very low margins today. You might vote against 32 if you believe that as a result, price increases will occur for basic goods and services, and so it will be inflationary in that regard. And you might vote against 32 if you believe that having to pay workers more will trigger work reductions, fewer hours, and fewer positions, job losses. So let's stop here and see what questions there are on 6 and 32. What kind of forced labor do prisoners have currently? That's about Proposition 6. The answer to that is they do kitchen work, they do janitorial work, and some of them actually do teaching. Those who have a specialty, either in an academic field or in an industrial field, will be called upon to help other prisoners learn. So it's more or less what you would expect. And the other question on Prop 6, does it allow for paid work in prisons? And might some prisoners who are doing forced labor be switched to paid labor? And is there an estimate of how much work might be switched? I believe it's possible for the prisons to pay the prisoners. I have not read of any limitations on that. So for the kitchen work, they could continue to have the same prisoners do that work and simply pay them, or they could bring in outside contractors in order to do that work. So I believe that's a possibility. Good. One more Marco Rubio moment here, and we'll move on. Proposition 33 will allow more local rent control. At the moment, local rent control applies in about 16 localities in California, Los Angeles County, a bunch of cities in Los Angeles County, and a whole bunch of cities in the Bay Area, including Mountain View. And also, I believe, Palm Springs outside of those two areas. Local rent control ordinances are limited by a 1995 state law called Costa-Hawkins, named after the two authors. And it says that local rent control laws cannot apply to single-family homes. It cannot apply to any units built after 1995, so almost 30 years ago. And it can't apply when a new tenant moves in, and that would be called vacancy control. So all of the local rent control ordinances have to conform to these laws or to these limitations. Under Prop 33, those would all be lifted, and cities such as Mountain View would be allowed to modify their rent control ordinances to apply to these three types of rental properties. However, none of the cities or counties are required to make any changes to their local laws. So it would be up to each city to decide what to do with the new flexibility that Prop 33 would allow. Also, any units in California that are not covered under local rent control ordinances are currently covered by the Tenant Protection Act, which does impose a measure of rent control on those units. So, for instance, the Tenant Protection Act, rather than having a fixed built after date of 1995, has a moving date of 15 years ago. So if you live in a unit in Mountain View or Los Altos that was built, say, in 2002, that wouldn't be covered under local rent control, but it is covered by the Tenant Protection Act. Now, the Tenant Protection Act is set to expire in 2030. However, there's a widespread expectation that it will be renewed and possibly made permanent. So let's move on to arguments in favor and against 33. You might vote for 33 if you believe that renters need stronger protections from gouging during this housing crisis. That 33 will allow cities and counties to choose controls that make sense locally without the restrictions that Costa-Hawkins places on them. And that existing restrictions, such as the 1995 built after date, are arbitrary and harmful and make no sense in today's world. You might vote against 33 if you believe that it would open the door to bad faith rent control laws intended to prevent construction of new units. Let me go into a little bit of detail on this. Since Prop 33 would allow a locality to regulate any unit, regardless of when it was built, and also to prevent rent increases between tenants, in other words, to enact vacancy control, it would open the door to a rent control ordinance that was so restrictive that any new rental properties would fail to pencil out. There's no way they could be profitable because the rent that they would be allowed to collect would not be market rate rent, it would be controlled rent. Under Prop 33, rent control could apply to brand new units. Also, Prop 33 would make it harder to build affordable housing and to enforce housing laws at the state level. And finally, Prop 33 could reduce home values. And the theory here is that rent-controlled areas are areas where the landlords have a reduced incentive to conduct maintenance. And because of that, there is a higher likelihood that the rental properties will become blighted, and that will reduce home values in the whole area. So that's Proposition 33. Now, Proposition 33 is sponsored by the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, and related to Prop 33 is Prop 34, which is sponsored by the Apartment Owners Association. Prop 34 is written in such a way that it applies only to the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. The AIDS Healthcare Foundation is a medical slash pharmaceutical nonprofit that runs pharmacies and does patient outreach and patient care for AIDS patients. And also the pharmacies are general purpose pharmacies. Um, and therefore it receives most of its income from state and federal um, funding to take care of insurance for the indigent and low income. Under Prop 34, uh, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation is the only entity that qualifies for the provisions because it's in the federal drug discount program. It operates multifamily housing units as a part of what it sees as its mission, not just to care about the medical, but also the whole patient. They provide rental properties. Um, and these units actually do have a history of health violations. They're down in LA. And it's spent over $100 million outside of patient care. The AIDS Healthcare Foundation spent millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, sponsoring and promoting Prop 33, and they have done similar things on previous ballots. So because of these provisions, Prop 34 would apply only to the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. And those of you who remember your civics class might remember the word, the phrase bill of attainder, which refers to a law that applies only to a single individual or organization. Um, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, or one of its allies, sued back in July to have 34 removed from the ballot because it amounts to a bill of attainder, which would be unconstitutional under Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution. Um, and the California Supreme Court punted. It said, come back to us if Prop 34 passes and we'll rule on whether this is constitutional. So they allowed it to continue on the ballot. If Prop 34 passes, then the AIDS Healthcare Foundation must spend at least 98% of its net revenue on direct healthcare services to patients. This would, in essence, prevent the AIDS Healthcare Foundation from doing the kind of political advocacy work that results in Proposition 33 and the previous propositions. If they do not comply, they could lose their tax exempt status, they could lose their license to practice medicine or pharmacy, and they would become ineligible for certain government grants or contracts. So it's got teeth. You might vote in favor of 34 if you believe that healthcare organizations should focus on patient care, their original mission, and not stray into politics. And you might vote for 34 if you believe that it's wrong to spend income from government drug programs on political crusades. You might vote against 34 if you believe that the only purpose of the measure is to silence an advocacy group, and that ballot propositions should never be weaponized to target a single organization or person. So in other words, you might vote against Prop 34 as kind of a meta vote, not against the provisions of the proposition, but against the existence of such a finely targeted ballot measure. So that's 33 and 34. Let's pause here and take a couple of questions. What is the percentage allowable rent increase in cities without rent control? And what percentage rent increase in cities with rent control? Well, the cities with rent control, it varies from city to city. The cities without rent control are under the provisions of the back up here, Tenant Protection Act. And I do not have that figure. Oh, actually, I do. Yes. The Tenant Protection Act limits rent increases annually to 5% plus inflation with a cap of 10%. So between 5 and 10%. All right. Off we go. Proposition 35 would earmark health plan tax for Medi-Cal. I'm going to take a deep breath. This one is exquisitely complicated. All right, my first bullet here does not talk about Prop 35. It talks about the current situation. Today, managed care organizations, and we're talking about very large managed care organizations such as Kaiser or Blue Shield, they pay a special tax to the state. And I'm not really sure it qualifies as a tax, and you'll see why in a second. Anyway, it amounts to billions of dollars. It's roughly $10 billion. And they pay this every year. And the reason they do it is if the state is able to collect this money from these organizations, they can then go to the federal government, and the federal government will match uh, most of that. I believe it's 1 for 1. Um, so in the past year, the state realized $8 billion in federal funds. Um, Now the state turns around and repays the managed care organizations for what the state temporarily had, and it repays them from the matching funds that the federal government gave out, and also using a portion of this special tax. Um, and the reason that the healthcare plans cooperate with the state and hand over these billions of dollars is that the state promises not just to make them whole, to reimburse them for the tax, but also to use the windfall, the increased money that they get to crank up the level of Medi-Cal reimbursements. So what's Medi-Cal and what's reimbursement? Medi-Cal is California's health insurance plan for people who can't afford health insurance. And it covers, I believe it's 15 million people in California. And it's a joint state federal program. The feds pay roughly 60% of it, the state 40%. And it's got a budget of $160 billion a year. So it's a huge program. That's what Medi-Cal is. When a provider, a doctor or a nurse or some other medical care provider, gives services to a Medi-Cal patient, they then apply to be paid by the state, and that payment is called a reimbursement. The Medi-Cal reimbursement rates are considered, especially given the cost of living in California, they're considered very low. And many providers in private practice are unable to take as many Medi-Cal patients as they would like because they aren't really paid, reimbursed enough to break even. And so they have to take patients with private insurance, which pays much more to compensate, and find themselves turning away certain Medi-Cal patients. So the idea that paying this special tax would crank up the Medi-Cal reimbursement rate is very important to these managed care organizations and to other providers who cover who provide services to Medi-Cal patients. So I tried to boil that down. There are a lot of details that I've left out. Prop 35 is there because, as part of the solution to this year's budget crisis, remember the budget crisis? The state reneged on its promise to increase the Medi-Cal reimbursements and instead used that extra money to provide the standard level of reimbursement and used the rest of that money to fill the giant budget gap. Hence Prop 35. Prop 35 was sponsored by those healthcare organizations and others who depend on Medi-Cal payments for their income. Prop 35 will require the state to spend this revenue to increase Medi-Cal reimbursements, and it specifies the areas for the reimbursements. It'll be primary and specialty care, it'll be emergency care, uh, things like ambulances, family planning, mental health, and prescription drugs. Now, this is not the whole spectrum of what Medi-Cal pays for. This leaves out things like a program to provide uninterrupted Medi-Cal coverage to children until age 5, and it leaves out home nursing, and it leaves out non-emergency transport, and several others. Prop 35 applies purely to these specified areas. Now, the state could use general funds in order to crank up the reimbursement rate for the things that are not in this list. So you might vote in favor of Prop 35 if you think it's important to restore this 2023 agreement to use the funds to increase reimbursements to the healthcare providers. You might vote in favor of 35 if you agree that higher reimbursements will guarantee access for more Medi-Cal patients because the providers won't be forced to turn them away in order to break even. And you might vote in favor of 35 if you believe that the most important types of healthcare are given funding priority. You might vote against 35 if you agree that specifying how the funds are to be spent restricts the legislature's ability to handle budget crises. Some people have labeled Proposition 35 budgeting by ballot box, meaning that it adds yet another requirement to what has to go into the budget each year. And little by little, the legislature is losing its flexibility and its ability to react and respond to changing financial and other conditions. And you might vote against Prop 35 if you believe that the list that I had at the bottom of the previous slide excludes important areas such as private duty nursing and continuous coverage for children up to 5. So that's 35. And we've got one more state proposition. So let's do that. Proposition 36 would increase penalties for theft and drug crimes. This, to some extent, undoes Proposition 47 from 10 years ago. Prop 36 would change certain misdemeanors to felonies, in particular, theft of merchandise or property under $950 if the person accused has 2 prior theft convictions. And it will also turn from a misdemeanor into a felony drug possession if the person has 2 prior drug convictions. If there are multiple thefts of merchandise or property under $950, they can be added together to trigger the felony threshold. If 3 or more people commit theft or property damage crime together, that would qualify them. That would expose them to a 3-year sentence extension. And finally, the third-time drug offenders from the first bullet point, the drug possession of 2 prior drug convictions, if they are convicted of a third drug offense, they could choose drug or mental health treatment instead of prison time. It would be up to a 3-year prison sentence for a felony drug conviction. But under Prop 36, if they choose treatment instead, they would have that felony conviction wiped off their record, assuming they complete the treatment program. You might vote in favor of 36 if you believe we need tougher laws against smash and grab thefts, and that these will protect businesses in particular. That criminals shouldn't be able to duck the $950 limit with smaller thefts. And that treatment for repeat drug offenders will reduce crime and substance abuse. You might vote against 36 if you believe that it's unneeded because of new state laws signed in August. And this is late breaking news. It happened after the state ballot pamphlet went to press. And so you might not be aware of it, but in mid-August, Governor Newsom signed a suite of 10 state laws, many of which overlap with or duplicate elements of Prop 36. In particular, adding multiple thefts together to reach the $950 threshold, group crimes, fencing stolen merchandise on the internet. One of the laws that covers something not in Prop 36 would allow businesses to obtain restraining orders against people who harass or their employees or have been seen stealing, have been convicted of theft from a given establishment. So this could be a reason to vote against Prop 36, that if you believe that those new laws take away the necessity for this initiative. The third strike could make stealing a candy bar into a felony. Remember that the third theft can be something of any value, and that would change the third theft from a misdemeanor to a felony. And finally, you might vote against Prop 36 if you believe that it will increase the prison population, costing billions of dollars, and risking a replay of the overcrowding crisis from 10 and 15 years ago. You might remember that at one point, the California prison system had a population that was over 200% of its designed capacity, and the US Supreme Court had to step in and declare that to be cruel and unusual punishment. And the state then embarked on a program of shipping less violent criminals to the county jails, and the county jails would then release their least violent and lowest risk offenders. And we also saw liberalization of certain laws like Proposition 47. So if you believe that 36 will lead potentially to a replay of that problem, you might vote against it. All right, so that's the end of the statewide ballot propositions. And the question is, are there any questions? California prisons, aren't they privatized? I don't know for sure, but my understanding is that most of the California prisons are publicly owned and publicly operated, but I don't know. All right, and we've got one more question. For Proposition 35, are the managed healthcare providers legally able to refuse service to Medi-Cal patients? The answer to that, I believe, is no. I was referring primarily to healthcare providers in private practice, not part of a managed healthcare organization, when I was talking about those who are unable to break even. Did the previous agreement with the legislature lead to an increase in Medi-Cal patients being treated? That I don't know. So this is a bit more detail on how the managed healthcare organizations work. And by the way, if you are a member of a health maintenance organization, an HMO, that's a type of managed healthcare organization. All right, good. Well, thank you all for the perceptive questions. And I'm now going to switch gears and move on to the local measures. There are 4 of them. Depending on where you live, you might see 1 or more of them. Those of us living in Mountain View will see G and AA. If you live in the Los Altos School District, you'll see double E. And if you're in the part of the Los Altos School District that's in the city of Mountain View, you might see G and double E. And there is a piece of the city of Los Altos that's in the Cupertino School District, and those of you there will see Z. Off we go. Measure G in Mountain View. For properties sold for over $6 million, Proposition G would increase an existing transfer tax. Currently, it's at $3.30 per thousand to $15 per thousand. Now, these numbers are very small. Let me put them in context. If you were to sell a $6 million property in Mountain View, under today's laws, you would be asked to give roughly $20,000 to the city. If Prop G passes or Measure G passes, that would be 90,000 instead. I believe I've got those figures right. I might have to pull out my calculator and verify. At any rate, sales of less than $6 million are not affected. And to my knowledge, there are no $6 million residential properties. So Prop G, Measure G, really applies only to commercial properties in Mountain View. And that could be multi-unit apartment buildings. It could be the Googleplex. It could be real estate downtown or in one of our shopping areas. If Measure G passes, it's estimated to bring in roughly $9.5 million to the city. And this is money that the city can use for operations. However, the city has promised to steer it to these areas, to replacing the public safety building. That's the police station located near the Shoreline Boulevard overpass over the train tracks. It would also be used on parks, open space, and biodiversity, and support for affordable housing. You might vote in favor of G if you believe that the city's infrastructure needs upgrades, such as the public safety building, that city tax revenue has not kept up with increasing costs, and that it will have no impact on residential home sales because homes in Mountain View just aren't valued above $6 million. You might vote against Measure G if you believe that the money will all be used for the public safety building, but there are other needs, that rents will increase because this will tend to increase the sale prices of multi-unit apartments, and therefore that cost will be passed on to the renters. And it's got no expiration date. So even though we haven't got any $6 million properties today, it will eventually start having an impact on residential home sales. So that's Measure G in Mountain View. Next, Measure Z, the Cupertino Union School District, which is K or pre-K now, all the way through 12th grade. This is a $347 million bond to upgrade aging schools. So this is for facilities improvements, roofs and plumbing, seismic safety, and expand classrooms for STEM and arts. As you can see, these are all capital improvements that are intended to last for decades. If you pay property tax within that district, this will add roughly $200 per $1 million of your assessed property value. So if you've got a home with an assessed value of, say, $3 million, this will increase your property taxes by about $600 a year. There is a Citizens Oversight Committee and annual audits for the spending of this bond money. And as we discussed earlier, this requires just a 55% vote, not the 2/3 that it would currently for other types of taxes because it's a school bond. And also, it is understood that the school district will then turn around and apply for matching funds from the state, assuming Proposition 2 passes and that money is available. You might vote in favor of Z if you believe that it keeps property taxes at current levels. And let me clarify that Measure Z will more or less replace an expiring property tax increase, that it will keep our children safe and help them learn by giving them better buildings, and it will update facilities for counseling and for special education services. You might vote against Z if you recall that the last bond was only 12 years ago for $220 million. Wasn't that enough? That enrollment in the district has declined over the past, I believe, it was 5 to 8 years. It's declined by almost 4,000 students, down to 13,467 students. And therefore, rather than raising money to remodel all of the schools, the city would be better, or the school district would be better off consolidating, perhaps temporarily closing some schools, applying the facilities funding that it has to the existing schools and getting new income by renting out the temporarily closed schools. And finally, an argument against Measure Z that you'll see is that the poor academic scores do not justify more money for this district. Question is whether the school district has earned this bond. You'll see that language in your ballot pamphlet. So let me stop here and take questions on G and Z. I see one question here. What expenses does the city incur when property is transferred? Right. So when you sell a piece of property in the city of Mountain View, the city is currently collecting this transfer tax. The question is this transfer tax currently used to offset any associated expenses on the part of the city? And the answer to that is, I don't know. I've never thought about it, and I haven't asked. It's not part of the official arguments in favor or against the measure in the ballot pamphlet. So this is a potential area for research for some of you. I don't know exactly what that. You have stumped me. All right, we are in the home stretch here. We've got just two left. The first is a parcel tax in the Mountain View Huisman School District. Now, this is not a property tax in the sense that we just saw from Cupertino District that would fund capital improvements. Instead, this is a parcel tax. There's an existing parcel tax in Mountain View Huisman of $191 per parcel that was approved, as you can see, 7 years ago. The proposed parcel tax would be $150 per 1,000 square feet of building. So if you live in a house that's 2,000 square feet, this would increase your tax from $191 to $300. If you have a large business, like say the Walmart store in Mountain View or the Googleplex, and have many thousands of square feet, your property tax is going to go up much more significantly if AA passes. And it's estimated that this will raise $5.5 million annually for the district. And unlike the bonds, the local bonds that you will see in Cupertino and the Los Altos School District, this parcel tax can be used for general operations for any purpose that the district puts it to. And they promise in the ballot argument, and I believe actually as part of the bill, to use it to increase teacher salaries, to help teachers afford to live in this area, and to retain the highest quality teachers. for academic support for students struggling with reading and writing, and for STEM programs. Now, because this is not a bond for capital improvements, 2/3 vote is required, not just the 55%. And this parcel tax will expire in 8 years. So you might vote for AA if you believe that it will fund competitive pay for teachers in an expensive area, that it is fair because large businesses will pay more than homeowners, and that voters approved similar measures twice before, and we should continue in order to fund our school district fully to the extent that it needs to be. Arguments against. The district should manage its finances better. It shouldn't need this extra income. Tax increases hurt everyone. The increased property taxes will lead to higher prices or higher costs, at least, for the businesses that are going to be affected. And once again, the district has not earned this tax increase through improved student performance, that we should reward the district if it performs well. But if the test scores are falling, as they are currently, then the people in that district have the right and perhaps the obligation to withhold their financial support. So that's Proposition AA. And finally, Proposition EE, bonds for facilities improvements for the Los Altos School District. So once again, this is a 55% bond for capital improvements. This one's for $350 million. Once again, STEM classrooms and roofs, windows, heating, cooling, plumbing, also traffic improvements around the various schools. So this will be paid off by adding $300 in property tax per $1 million of assessed property value. So if the assessed value of your home in the Los Altos district is $4 million, then this will add $1,200 to your property tax bill every year. As with the Cupertino measure, there's a citizens oversight committee to make sure that the money is being spent effectively, and there are annual audits, and it's a 55% vote required to pass. You might vote in favor of EE if you agree that local schools haven't been upgraded in 3 decades, that too many students are in old portable classrooms, and that's undesirable, and that we need Proposition EE or Measure EE to relieve overcrowding at the charter school sites, that the charter school, which currently occupies parts of 2 other schools, is the Measure E will allow a new site to be built, and whether that gets occupied by either the charter school or some other school is up to the district to decide, but some new facility is needed in order to relieve the overcrowding at those 2 sites. Measure E will provide the funding to make that happen. So that's an argument in favor of EE. You might vote against EE if you see that enrollment has declined by almost 900 students to 3,355, and therefore the district ought to consolidate rather than improve all of the campuses. The last bond was only 10 years ago for $150 million. What have they done with that money? And finally, that bond money cannot increase teacher pay. It is restricted for these capital improvement projects, and will do nothing to help the district retain the best teachers or attract the best teachers. So that's Measure EE. And let me take questions on AA and EE. We've got one. Is there a plan identifying the schools and projects to be funded, and what is the priority? Measure double E is a little bit ambiguous about this because there are negotiations ongoing with, my understanding is the city of Mountain View over a site there that is a potential expansion site for the Los Altos School District, but they're unable to commit to that at the moment. How much will go to the remaining 9 schools and how much to the 10th school? That I can't tell you. That will be up to the District Board of Trustees with the advice and consent of the Oversight Committee, the Citizens Oversight Committee. So I believe that's the end of the questions for these ballot propositions. Let me put in one last plug for our online resources, League of Women Voters of Los Altos Mountain View area. Visit our website and you'll get pointers to all of the resources and more. And once again, you'll get to see videos of the local forums that will help you decide which of these candidates to vote for. For the local boards, almost all of these contests, you'll vote for more than one. You might vote for 3 or 4 new members of a school board or of a city council. So you're going to want to hear from a lot of candidates. And these videos are really helpful. And we've also got a document that helps you know whether you're ready to vote. And my advice, once again, is to give yourself plenty of time because it's a long, long ballot. And you may find yourself needing to look things up or referring back even to this video to help you out. So do it soon and give yourself plenty of time to do it. You will feel good about having done your duty as a citizen and helping us all make smarter decisions. And it looks like I've even ended a few minutes early. So thank you all for attending. Let me, now that I've finished the formal part of the presentation, let me ask the organizers if we have time to take a few audio questions, if anybody has got.
Okay, sure, Pete. That's fine. Thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Good. So I believe at the moment, if you raise your hand, the people running this might recognize you and you can turn on your mic and ask me a question over the air.
There are questions in the Q&A, the new ones.
Okay, good. So what I'm going to do is stop sharing the thank you slide and we'll just return this to video. And away we go. Okay, in the Q&A, what are the best resources or methods for finding out what organizations are backing particular measures? That's a great question. My favorite actually is to use what the Secretary of State's office makes available. And that is the Cal Access financial campaign finance system. So search for Cal Access online and it will be part of SOS, which stands for Secretary of State, sos.ca.gov. There will be part of that website and you'll be able to see the various committees and campaigns. And if you dig in a little deeper, you'll see exactly who has made the largest donations to the pro and the con sides of all of the ballot measures.
And Pete, that's also available on Vote 411. There are links to the Secretary of State's information.
Great, good. Thank you for that, Karen.
Sure.